Hey everybody, Travis here with the Alpine Geek, and today I'm going to be showing you how to plan an on-trail backpacking trip using Gaia GPS. So I'm here on the Gaia GPS webpage, and the first thing I'm going to do is log in. You need at least the free version of Gaia GPS. You have to be logged in to use it, although I do recommend the paid versions. Alright. If you've not been to Gaia GPS before, it will look something like this, although you won't be centered on this part of the map. So what we're going to plan in this tutorial is a backpacking trip from Snoqualmie Pass to Stevens Pass in Washington State. So I happen to have that already on my screen, but if you didn't, you could just do a search for Snoqualmie Pass. Oh, and they even have PCT Section J, which is what we want. And it will just zoom the map to where you want to be. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is just get a sense of how far this particular trip is going to be. And then I want to break it out into a day-by-day route plan. So in order to get just the really basic overview of how long the total trip is, and to just get a quick sense for how to do routes in Gaia GPS, we're going to go over here to the left to the Create Route tool, which is the bottom tool on the toolbar, and click on that. And once I do that, you'll notice all these colorful lines show up, and that's just showing all of my personal tracks that I've logged in Washington. And unfortunately, there's not a way to get rid of them. When you're drawing routes, they just appear. So we'll have to live with that for the moment. But I'm going to click here at the beginning of Snoqualmie Pass. And then I'm just going to click here at Stevens Pass and see what it does. And so now you can see that it has found what it believes is the most efficient hiking route from Snoqualmie to Stevens Pass. It shows me the elevation profile of that route and the mileage and the cumulative gain and loss. Now, the only problem with this is it's not actually following the PCT in all spots, and I want to correct that. So we can do that very easily in Gaia GPS. For example, if I zoom in up here, you can see at the end it wants to follow the road because it thinks that's more efficient, and while it might be, it also sounds really boring. So I'm just going to click. Notice the hand icon. I'm going to click and drag that section back over to the PCT. And it did a little rerouting, but it's still trying to get me to the road, so I'm just going to click and drag again. And now this is all following the PCT like I expected. And I can kind of follow this. This section right here also wanted to stray, so I can just correct that. And it looks like, yep, it's now following the PCT the entire way, which is great. And you can see that, yeah, the mileage went up a little bit, but it beats walking on the road. And this is really all I wanted as far as getting just this basic overview, was to know, okay, it's about 69, 70 miles and 22,000 feet of gain and some change. So I know now that if I want to do a 7-day trip, I'm going to be shooting for roughly 10 miles per day and about a little more than 3,000 feet of gain per day. Now that just is the average, but it's a good thing to kind of keep in mind so that I can sort of pace myself as I'm doing this. I don't actually need to save this route, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit cancel, and it'll go away. Because now we want to actually get into planning the route per day. And the first thing I'm going to do before we get into that is show you a little bit about layers in Gaia GPS. So I'm going to click here on the Layers and Overlays tool, which has the stacked double diamonds. And if you've not used Gaia GPS before, it will look something like this. It will be very bare. and that's fine because we're going to populate it here in a minute. But the first thing I want to show you before we get into that is this very first box where it says map overlays. It might say something different for you. And remember how when I started drawing the routes, all of my previous routes showed up? I can turn those off here. And you can actually, any waypoints that you've saved and waypoint labels, you can turn those on and off. If you find they get in their way, just turn them off. The other thing, before we get into the nitty-gritty of map layers, is this public Trax overlay. And it's actually quite useful. I find it more useful for things like scrambles, so I'm just going to zoom into a section of the PCT here. Sure, this is a good spot. And I'm going to turn on the public Trax. So everybody that's used Gaia GPS that has declared their tracks public, you can see them all overlaid onto the map. And that can be really helpful when you're considering doing some off-trail stuff where there's not an obvious path. You can see where other people have gone before you. So I can see right here, Mount Thompson, there's a route here on the west side, which I believe is a climbing route, and then there's a route here on the east side, which I think is actually the descent route for most climbers, but I believe it can also be a scramble route to the top. Now you do have to play around a little bit. Tracks will come and go as you zoom in and out, but if you find one that's interesting to you, you can always click on it and then go to the details. And if you want, you can download that data. So this is a fantastic resource, but it's also useful even for on-trail trips. So I will show you a perfect example of that. Actually, I'm going to turn it off. If I go over to Robin Lakes, or Tuckin Robin Lake, which is right here, you can see by just looking at the map, it looks like there's a nice trail from Tuck Lake over to Robin Lake. And if that's all you saw and that's all you knew, you would be tempted to believe it, and I couldn't blame you for wanting to do that. But if you turn on the public Trax, you'll notice that none of the public Trax have ever overlapped that supposed trail. And the reason is because that trail does not exist. So even if all you're going to be doing is on-trail travel, if you're going to a place that you haven't been before, it's well worth turning on the public overlay, the public Trax overlay, just to make sure that, in fact, what the map says is a trail is, in fact, still a trail that's used by real people. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because it's not relevant to the rest of our example. So now we'll go back to Snoqualmie Pass and get into actually working with map layers. So this is the default Gaia GPS map layer, or their Gaia Topo, and it's pretty nice. This is, if you're using the Gaia GPS app, which I highly recommend, this is the default that you're going to get, and it's usually quite sufficient. But when you're at home and you're planning, oftentimes there are other map layers that can be more useful, and for this example in particular, there are. So I'm going to click down here at the bottom where it says to add map layers. And this brings up all the different map layers that I can add from various countries, US, Canada, Europe, Australia. We're obviously going to be focusing on the US for this tutorial. So I'm going to click on there, and there's a whole bunch of options that you can use. For this particular example, we're going to go to the Nat Geo Pacific Crest Trail map. And I'm just going to click on the green plus, which will apply it. And you can see that it's a little more noisy, but what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that on this illustrated PCT Trails map, it actually shows the location of campsites, and that will be very helpful for us. There's also the Nat Geo's Trails illustrated, and while it's not useful for this particular example, for other areas it also will often list campgrounds. And there's one more, but it's not listed in the United States. Under the Topo maps layers, I'm presuming these apply across multiple countries, which is why they're not under United States. But another one that I really like is outdoors. And again, it's not useful for this particular example, although it does highlight the PCT quite nicely, but it doesn't show any of the campsites. But again, in a lot of different areas, you will see campsites listed on this outdoors layer. So that's one well worth adding to your sort of frequent layers palette. Under satellite imagery, it's always nice to have some satellite imagery layers. I like this satellite with labels. I just find labels can be quite helpful. But you could turn on whichever ones you prefer. Under feature and weather overlays, there's a whole bunch of these and you can play around with them. The one that we're going to use in this particular tutorial is called Roadless Areas. And don't worry about what it does at the moment. Others you might be interested in turning on would be the slope angle shading. If you're familiar with CalTopo's slope angle shader, you can use that in Gaia GPS. And then some of the weather overlays might be of interest to you, but we're not going to use them in this tutorial. So when I go back, I can now see all these different layers that I added show up here. And I'm going to turn them off. The roadless areas, satellite, I'm going to just turn them all off. But now they're easily accessible, and I can just turn them back on whenever I want to. I can also change the opacity. So if I wanted to sort of see both at the same time, you can do that by dragging this slider. I find it's often too noisy to have too many layers overlapping like that, but can also be a nice way to just switch between them if you want to see a particular feature. All right. What I can also do, instead of clicking on the little circle to toggle it on and off, I can just click on the name, and that'll bring up a description of it, as well as a legend that you can actually open in a new window if you're curious what any of the symbols on the map are. And if you want to remove it, you can click here, and it will be removed from sort of this frequently used section. All right. So again, for this example, we want to focus on the National Geographic PCT trail map. So I'm going to turn that on, and we're going to get started. One thing you'll note here, I showed you how to just measure the total distance yourself, but on this particular map, it actually has written on it, if I'm going north on section J, it's 71 miles. So I could use that as well, but you often won't have that data. So, all right. I am going to close the map layers for now, and we're going to start drawing our routes. So as you recall, we're averaging about 10 miles per day and a little over 3,000 feet of gain. So we're rarely, if ever, going to hit that exactly, but we can kind of keep that number in the back of our minds as we do this. So I'm going to create a route. And again, as I do that, all my old tracks are going to show up and kind of get in the way, but we'll ignore them. So I'm going to click here at the start of Snoqualmie Pass. And I'm going to just click to the first campsite. And so 3.7 miles, 2,000 feet of gain. I also see the elevation profile, so I can see that it's going to basically be going consistently uphill that entire time. And I can decide, yeah, I can go further than that. So just some interesting things when it comes to drawing routes in Gaia. Let's see if we can get up here to Gravel Lake. So I click there, and now I'm at 7 miles, 3,600 feet. So that's a little higher than I want on the gain, but not quite far enough for the distance. So I'd say, well, what if I can get all the way to down here? So that put me at 14 miles and 6,800 feet of gain, which is far too much. So I can easily undo that by just clicking on the big circle and clicking the trash icon. And it'll just go right back to where it was. The other thing I could do is rather than clicking a new dot, I could just drag this one to the base of Huckleberry Mountain, and it'll update the route. And that's looking pretty good for me for day 1. Just under 10 miles, 4,600 feet of gain. It'll be a rough first day, but probably worth it. And what I'm going to do for this example is I'm going to create a waypoint at each campsite, and then I'm going to save each route. And I'm going to save each route in a different color, so that way when I look at them at a glance, I can easily tell where the distinctions are. So I can create a waypoint very easily right here by just clicking on the point and clicking the green pin, and that will actually create a waypoint. And I'm going to call this day 1 camp, and I'm going to use a little campsite icon. So now that's saved, and now I'm going to save the route. I'm going to call it day 1. Purple is perfectly fine. And now I'll just continue from there. So that's now the start of day 2, and I think, can we get to Spectacle Lake? Yeah, and it looks like we can actually go further than Spectacle Lake. So I might try this campsite here. Now notice, it took me to Spectacle Lake and back, so I don't actually want to do that. Because if I'm not going to be camping at Spectacle Lake, I don't want to go to it. So I'm just going to drag it instead over to this grayed out campsite. And that puts me at 10 miles and 3,000 feet. So that is almost exactly what I would like to do for that day. But I'm curious about this grayed out campsite. I can turn on the satellite view, and then I can zoom in to this area just to get a sense. If this is where I'm going to be camping, does it look like there's going to be a lot of spots or very few spots? And so in this case, it looks like it's mostly just forest everywhere. And then a water source, which is nice. So I might may not be sold on that particular campsite, and I might try to go up to Lima Meadow, even though it's a little further. So that's 11 miles, 3,100 feet of gain. Yeah, I think I would go there. And again, I can now examine what this campsite might look like. Just turning on the satellite, and I can see the meadow right here. So I'm going to go with that for day 2. So again, I'm going to click on the last point and the pin icon to create a waypoint, day 2 camp. And then save day 2. Now we'll go into day 3. And now, finally, for the last day, we just go from our final campsite to Stevens Pass parking lot. And make sure it followed the PCT, which it did. And so the last day is only a little over 7 miles, less than 2,000 feet of gain. So, hooray. So now you can see that we have individual route segments for the entire trip and individual waypoints for our campsites. Now, the next thing I want to do, just to kind of make this a little cleaner, is group all these into a folder. So I'm going to go up here to the main menu and choose where it says folders. You can ignore my folders. I like to have folders for each type of activity. But we're going to create a new folder. And I'm just going to call it the PCT demo. And now I want to add those route segments and those waypoints. So I'm going to go back to my name where it says under the main menu, routes. And since we just created them, these are all of those segments. And I can also see where I made a mistake and called day 4 day 5, so I can actually fix that. So that's day 4, not day 5. And I can just click all of these since it happens to be all of them. And you can file it to a folder. I'm going to file it to that PCT demo folder. Now I'm going to do the same thing. With the waypoints, I'm going to go to waypoints. And I did the same thing with the waypoints. So this is the day number 4 camp. Oops. This is the day 4 camp. And this can also be helpful a lot of times if you're saving an activity out in the field. It gets a really weird name. And so you can go into the website and actually fix those names. So now here I need to click individual ones because I have a lot more waypoints. So I'll click the 6 camp waypoints, file it to folder, PCT demo. And now the nice thing is when I go to my folders, I have this nice PCT demo folder that just has all of my route segments and all of my waypoints without all those other noisy things. It also, as it happens, shows me the total route and the total gain for that trip. And I can share this with people or download it as a zip file or whatever. So it can be nice to kind of group them. It's also nice when you want to delete them, you can delete the folder and then they'll all be deleted at the same time. And I can click on this icon here for full screen. And now it'll actually let me see it on the main map without necessarily having all the noise of all those other things. So that's another benefit to having a folder. And if I click on this exit highlight, then it'll go back to the way it was before, but I don't want to do that. All right. So another thing that can be quite helpful when you're talking about planning a backpacking trip is planning escape routes. Now, for a single day trip, often, almost always, if something goes wrong, you just turn around and go back the way you came. But in the case of a multi-day backpacking trip, that's often not the best course of action. And so having some thought about how you can escape from your trip somewhere in the middle is definitely worthwhile. So not so much that you need an evacuation, because then you'll probably stay in place, but it could be something as simple as the weather turned, or you ran out of supplies, or you got really bad blisters, but you can walk out. So planning for an escape route is something that's certainly worthwhile. And you could easily do that just by looking at a map, but there are some tools here in Gaia that can actually make that a little easier for you. And that's where we're going to turn on that Roadless Areas layer that I talked about at the beginning. So when I do that, it's at max opacity. If I zoom out, what it does is it basically blots out all of the roadless areas in orange, which means that everything that's shown has roads, and we can use that information to draw our eyes. So I can see it says there's a road here, Goldmire, there's a road here, obviously there's I-90. And so once I kind of get a sense for where the roads are, I can turn this off, or I can just turn it down, and I can see if I'm here at my camp on day 1, is there a way for me to get down to this Gold Creek road? And just by kind of looking at it, not really, not staying on trail. I would have to go off trail to do that, and that's probably going to be difficult. So on day 1, likewise, there's no way for me to really get north. There's no trails over here. So for day 1, chances are if I need to turn around, that's going to be the best course, is to just go back to the PCT. But as soon as we get to day 2, it would be a lot of miles to just turn around. And by turning on the roadless areas, I can see, hey, there's something over here. If I could get over here, I would be close to a road. And when I zoom in, in fact, I see a parking area. And now it's just a matter of, can I connect my campsite to this parking area? And now I can turn the roadless areas off or down, and I can clearly see that, yes, on day 2, there's a lake there's a trail right here, the Peat Lake Trail, and I could follow that all the way to this parking area. And that would be much shorter, and in fact, if I wanted to know what the distance would be, I could just create a route. It would be 6 miles to get out. And that's a lot better than 20 miles hiking all the way back to the starting point. On day 3, it looks like we're going to go toward that same parking area. It's just a matter of, is there a trail? And yes, it looks like there is right down here. The Waptis Burn Trail, Palali Ridge, etc., right down to the parking area. And you can do this for each day of your trip. For day 4, we're very close to a road. The Tukwala Meadows Trailhead is just a couple miles from Cathedral Pass. I actually think it's like 5. But very close. If we needed to bail, we could have someone pick us up at the Tukwala Meadows Trailhead. And we could signal them by either, if we have cell reception, we could call them, or if we had an inReach or some kind of satellite device, we could reach out to someone and update that. And what's nice about the roadless areas is just that it draws your eyes to where the roads are. So if I didn't have the roadless areas, this map is kind of noisy, and it's hard to see that right here, this is a road that you could get to. But when you turn on the roadless areas, it draws your eyes. And so I can see here on day 5, I could just go along this trail, and then there's the Deception Cutoff Trailhead. So it's a nice planning tool. Right here on day 6, we're about 1.5 miles from the Tunnel Creek Trailhead. And then obviously on day 7, it's just going to, well, actually, depending on where you're at on day 7, it might make sense to go back to Tunnel Creek or to Stevens Pass. But you can kind of see how this Roadless Areas tool, while a really ugly thing by itself, can actually be used to do some interesting planning. So the final thing you might want to do in Gaia is to print a map. Now, Gaia does not have the best map printing abilities. I prefer CalTopo for that. But what you can do is go to that folder, and then you can choose the print icon here. And that just ensures that all the other stuff don't get printed with it. Now, I've already kind of screwed up because I don't want the PCT map showing. So it'll print whatever you have displayed. So I'm going to go to turn off the National Geographic map. If I'm happy with the Gaia map, I could use it. I'm actually going to turn on a different map layer that's under the United States called the US Topo. And it's basically the updated vector-based version of the old USGS maps. So I'm going to turn off the Gaia Topo, and when I zoom in, it's actually a pretty nice map layer. And so I'm going to use that for printing. But basically, when you want to print in Gaia, you need to pull up the different layers the layer that you want to actually print, because what you see is what you get. I'll go to folders, PCT demo, hit the print icon. I could print this. Unfortunately, one of the big downsides with Gaia and printing is that you don't get to control the scale. You can control the paper size and the orientation, but you really can't control the scale, unfortunately. And so how you want to do it is up to you. I recommend for printing that you just do it in Topo, but if you want to do it in Gaia, you can mess with the zoom, and you could basically print a page for each day if you wanted to. Or however you want to do it. And when you click on print, you click the export PDF button, and you will get a PDF with that page. But again, it doesn't give you control over the scale, so I don't necessarily recommend it, but you could get a printed map that way. So that really wraps it up to hopefully give you some tools for your toolkit when you're planning backpacking trips or just any on-trail activity. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I hope to see you on the trail.